February 1945. Luzon, the Philippines. The jungle was still, heavy with heat and the smell of wet earth. Cicadas screamed above the whisper of soldiers advancing through vines and mud. Ahead, somewhere unseen, Japanese machine guns waited. Every tree looked alive, every shadow a trap. A flamethrower team moved forward. 2 men bent beneath metal tanks glinting like dull mirrors in the sun. The weapon hissed before it roared, a jet of liquid fire bursting across the foliage. Within seconds, the green world turned orange. The jungle itself seemed to exhale flame. Branches crackled, air shimmered, and the shriek of burning ammunition echoed from hidden bunkers. For a heartbeat, even the gunfire stopped. The Japanese defenders who had laughed at the clumsy American weapon now saw their fortifications erupt in fire. There was no time to run, only the sound of flames feeding on everything they had trusted for cover. And as the smoke rolled upward, it carried with it a new chapter in the Pacific War, one written not with bullets, but with fire. By the start of 1942, the Pacific had become a vast battlefield stretching from the jungles of New Guinea to the coral reefs of the Central Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan's empire expanded with stunning speed. Hong Kong, the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Each conquest was driven by the same doctrine: hold the perimeter, dig deep, and force the enemy to bleed for every yard. The United States, still reeling from its early losses, began to push back. It was a campaign defined by distance, humidity, and isolation. Every island taken had to serve as a step toward Japan itself, each a self-contained war of mud, coral, and smoke. By mid-1943, the American strategy of island hopping was underway. The goal was not to capture everything, but to leapfrog across key positions, airfields, ports, and strategic atolls that could bring the Japanese homeland within bomber range. Yet on every one of those islands, the U.S. Marines and Army troops encountered the same thing: silence that concealed steel and jungle that hid death. Japanese commanders had studied early American landings at Guadalcanal and Tarawa. They learned quickly, instead of throwing men into hopeless beach charges, they built fortresses within the earth itself. On Tarawa, pillboxes and bunkers were built from coconut logs, steel, and coral sand. On Saipan and Peleliu, entire mountains were hollowed out. Miles of tunnels, caves, and interlocking positions that made artillery bombardment nearly useless. In those dark tunnels, defenders waited for weeks, surviving on rationed rice and rainwater. Their mission was not victory, it was delay. Every hour they held out forced America to pay a higher price in lives and time. For the Americans, the situation presented a new kind of war. Traditional artillery and naval gunfire could level towns, but they could not reach men hidden under 30 feet of rock. The dense vegetation, vines, bamboo, and the thick canopy of palm leaves cloaked defensive positions so completely that soldiers often stumbled into them by accident. Rifle fire vanished into the trees. Grenades disappeared into undergrowth before they could explode. Even when the enemy was found, he would not surrender. Surrender was shame. Japanese soldiers considered capture a disgrace worse than death. They fought to the last man, often feigning death to strike again or detonating grenades against their own bodies when surrounded. The U.S. military began searching for ways to fight through this invisible fortress. Engineers, chemists, and infantry officers worked together to find something that could reach into caves, bunkers, and tunnels, something that could fill the unseen with fear and flame. The answer would come from an older weapon, one that had haunted battlefields since the First World War: the flamethrower. By 1943, small teams of engineers in the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service were testing portable flamethrowers in training grounds across the Pacific. The idea was brutally simple: use compressed nitrogen to propel a stream of thickened fuel that could ignite anything it touched. It could burn through brush, destroy fortifications, and drive defenders from their holes without the need for costly direct assaults. But on paper, it was still theory. In practice, it was dangerous, heavy, and terrifying to operate. The tanks carried on a soldier's back could ignite if hit. The operator was an immediate target, and the weapon's range, barely 30 yards, demanded that he stand almost face-to-face with the enemy. Yet as the war ground forward, American commanders began to see that there was no other way. They needed a weapon that could penetrate areas where bullets and shells couldn't. In the humid stillness of those jungles and volcanic ridges, the stage was set for the arrival of the flamethrower, a weapon that would turn the landscape itself into fire and change the way men thought about combat forever. And as the Marines prepared to test it in battle, engineers were already designing its mechanical evolution, a version not carried by men, but by steel. The first portable flamethrowers to reach the Pacific were crude and unpredictable. Officially designated the M1A1, each unit weighed nearly 70 pounds when filled with fuel. 2 heavy cylindrical tanks strapped to the back and a separate nozzle connected by hoses and pressure valves. The operator's view was limited, his movement restricted. A single bullet could rupture the tanks, turning him into a walking inferno. Still, men volunteered to carry them. In Marine and Army engineer units, flamethrower operators were often the smallest groups on the field, working in pairs, one to fire, one to cover. They were trained to approach within 30 yards of a bunker or cave, trigger a burst of fuel, and then retreat before enemy fire found them. Each shot lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds could transform the battle. When the first bursts were unleashed on Tarawa in 1943, the effect was immediate and horrifying. Japanese defenders who had survived hours of bombardment now faced walls of liquid fire seeping into their bunkers. The flames rolled across trenches, clinging to wood and flesh alike. The weapon did more than kill, it broke morale. Soldiers emerged from hiding, choking and blinded by smoke, their positions marked by pillars of flame visible for miles. It was brutal, but effective. Commanders realized they had found an instrument that could clear strongholds faster, and with fewer American casualties than artillery or grenades alone. Yet the weapon had limits. It was short-ranged, cumbersome, and risky. Operators were among the first targets for snipers. In the dense jungles of New Guinea or the coral ridges of Peleliu, the range was rarely enough to reach deep caves, and in the open, a flamethrower man was as good as dead once spotted. To overcome this, engineers in the field began experimenting. At first, they mounted flamethrowers on jeeps, then on landing vehicles. The breakthrough came with the M4 Sherman tank. By 1944, U.S. Marine engineers and Navy Seabees had adapted the tank's hull to carry pressurized fuel systems, creating a new weapon known as the flame tank. The most famous version, the POWs H-1, emerged in the Pacific campaigns of 1944-45. It replaced the main cannon with a flamethrower capable of projecting fire over 100 yards. Thick armor protected the crew, and internal fuel tanks carried hundreds of gallons of napalm-thickened gasoline. These tanks could do what men could not: advance under fire, sweep an area in seconds, and ignite positions buried deep within rock or reinforced concrete. They became the spearhead of the assault, moving methodically forward, scouring every ridge, trench, and tunnel mouth. Japanese soldiers had no effective counter. Anti-tank weapons were scarce, and most defensive guns had been built to target infantry, not heavily armored vehicles that spat flame instead of shells. Even the bravest defenders could not withstand what they could not breathe through or see. The visual impact was unforgettable. Entire hillsides glowed at night, the flames crawling like serpents through brush and cave openings. Reporters described the scenes as volcanoes come to life. Marines who followed behind spoke of the silence that followed: no gunfire, only the sound of burning. But for the men who wielded these weapons, there was no glory. Flamethrower operators lived with the knowledge that they were both feared and hated. Even among their own, they were viewed with unease, the agents of a weapon that burned rather than shattered. Some admitted they never forgot the smell that lingered afterward. By 1945, the flamethrower, once an experimental tool, had become a standard element of Pacific warfare. Each assault plan included flame teams and flame tanks. They were assigned to engineers, supported by rifle squads and demolition crews. Their targets were clear: pillboxes, caves, dugouts, and bunkers that refused to die. Every island from Peleliu to Iwo Jima, from Okinawa to Luzon, became a testing ground for this weapon's evolving form. It was fire-harnessed, directed, and industrialized, a perfect response to a war fought among roots, stone, and steel. The jungle had once been a shield for Japan's soldiers. Now it was their trap, and within that trap, every man, American or Japanese, would soon learn what it meant to face a weapon that turned the earth itself against its defenders. For the American soldier, the flamethrower was both salvation and a curse. It promised a way to reach the enemy hidden behind rock and soil, yet every man who carried it knew he would be the first target on the battlefield. Operators were trained under the harsh sun of Hawaii and the volcanic plains of the Marianas. They learned to move low, to use cover, and to calculate bursts precisely. Too short a stream and the target survived. Too long, and the back pressure risked an explosion. The tanks on their backs contained only a few seconds of fire, 10, sometimes 15 if rationed. Those seconds could decide a battle. Many called the flamethrower operator a walking bomb. His silhouette was unmistakable: two rounded tanks, one thick hose, and a glint of a brass nozzle. Japanese snipers would wait for that shape. In every assault, the first to fall were often the men with flame. Yet still they advanced, crouched, sweating under 80 pounds of steel and fuel, pushing forward into bunkers that belched smoke and gunfire. The weapon's effect on morale was immediate. Both friend and foe felt it. American troops followed flame teams with a strange mix of awe and dread. They cleared what no one else could. They walked into holes no man wanted to enter. The operators learned to work silently, to accept that their weapon inspired fear even among their own. For the Japanese soldier, the first encounter with fire was disbelief. Jungle positions that had survived naval bombardments and artillery for days suddenly collapsed in seconds. Men who had dug for months into coral and earth watched their fortresses melt around them. The flames crept along tunnels, devouring air and light. Survivors described the horror in brief, clipped fragments: burned lungs, blindness, confusion. Many were found with grenades still clutched in their hands, the pins unpulled. Those who lived long enough to be captured often arrived stunned, barely speaking, their faces blistered but expressionless. They had seen something beyond comprehension, a weapon that turned their own defenses into tombs. It was here, in the jungles and caves of the Pacific, that both sides confronted a new reality. reality. Technology had found a way to erase the last refuge of courage. Fire did not discriminate. It took air, sight, and will in an instant. And yet amid that inferno, tactics continued to evolve. The tactical angle, fire as a strategy. American assault doctrine in the Pacific was built on layers: artillery, naval bombardment, and infantry advance. But the Japanese system of defense, deep, dispersed, and invisible, demanded something new. It wasn't enough to bombard from afar. To win, attackers had to enter the labyrinth. Flamethrowers became part of a calculated sequence. Engineers advanced with infantry under covering fire. When a bunker was located, riflemen pinned down the defenders while the flamethrower team crept forward. Once in range, a burst of flame swept through the opening, followed by demolition charges to seal the position. Each engagement was a test of coordination. A flamethrower was useless without protection, and infantry could not move until the fire had done its work. Communication between small units became crucial. On Iwo Jima, where every foot of ground was contested, Marine engineers carried flamethrowers while tanks circled to provide supporting arcs of fire. Fire was no longer random, it was geometry. Flame teams mapped every angle of a bunker, learning where air vents fed oxygen and where tunnels connected. They could suffocate an entire network by igniting fuel at one entrance. Even the cave mouths that faced the ocean could be sealed by flame projected from tank-mounted nozzles 100 yards away. The results were devastating. At Peleliu, Marine units cleared hundreds of fortified caves in less than a week using coordinated flame assaults. At Okinawa, flame tanks became the lead elements of attack waves, burning through ridgelines that had withstood days of bombardment. But every advance carried a cost. The same heat that destroyed the enemy could ignite the jungle around friendly forces. More than one assault ended with entire hillsides burning uncontrollably, smoke obscuring movement and cutting off units. Flame was a weapon of victory but also chaos. Still, by late 1944, commanders had accepted it as indispensable. The flamethrower was no longer an experiment, it was doctrine. And its doctrine was simple: where the enemy hides, fire will follow. That tactical evolution, born from necessity and refined through horror, led naturally to the next question: how technology and leadership transformed the weapon from a man's burden into an army's instrument. The technological angle, engineering the inferno. The flamethrower was never elegant, but it was meticulously engineered. Every improvement was measured not by power alone, but by the seconds it could buy a soldier's life. By late 1943, the Chemical Warfare Service in the United States had begun testing new fuel formulas. Early mixtures burned too quickly, spraying gasoline that often evaporated before reaching its target. Engineers discovered that thickened fuels, blends of gasoline with rubberized additives or napalm compounds, burned longer and clung to surfaces. This discovery transformed the weapon from a short, dazzling burst into a rolling wave of sustained fire. Napalm, derived from aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids, was introduced in 1944. It changed everything. The flame no longer simply reached, it stayed. It crept into cracks, tunnels, and vents. It could not be wiped away or doused by dirt. For the first time, American forces had a weapon that could neutralize defensive systems built to withstand shells and bombs. Mechanically, the flamethrower evolved just as quickly. The M2 model, lighter and more reliable, replaced the earlier M1A1 in 1944. It featured improved valves, dual ignition systems, and a refined backpack harness that allowed greater movement. Its range increased to over 40 yards, still dangerously close, but far enough to give the operator a fighting chance. Even more revolutionary were the flame tanks. On Iwo Jima, Seabees and Army engineers modified Sherman tanks on site, fitting them with Ronson and POA CWS H1 flame systems. These conversions combined the tank's armor with the reach of the flamethrower, projecting napalm over 100 yards. Their performance astonished observers. Entire cave systems that had resisted artillery fire were cleared within minutes. The tanks could operate in terrain impassable to infantry, maintaining a constant sweep of flame across ridges and caves. They consumed enormous quantities of fuel, hundreds of gallons per sortie, yet their psychological effect was priceless. Still, the flamethrower remained imperfect. Its ignition system could fail in rain. Wind could deflect streams of flame back toward friendly troops. The weapon required courage, maintenance, and discipline, and every improvement was written in field reports, adjusted in real time between battles. Behind these developments stood thousands of anonymous technicians and field engineers, men who never saw combat, but whose work shaped every encounter on the front line. They were the quiet engineers of destruction, translating chemistry and mechanics into survival. And behind them stood leadership that saw in the weapon not cruelty, but necessity. In the leadership and enemy angle, command decisions in fire. The decision to deploy flamethrowers widely was not made lightly. American commanders understood both the tactical advantage and the moral unease. Generals like Holland M. Smith, commanding Marine forces in the Central Pacific, described the weapon as indispensable. The only way, he wrote, to deal with an enemy who will not come out. At the operational level, flamethrowers required specialized units. Engineers were retrained as flame sections. Logistics officers coordinated shipments of napalm, spare valves, and and ignition parts across thousands of miles of ocean. Supply ships became floating arsenals of fuel and compressed nitrogen. On the battlefield, leadership adapted quickly. Company commanders learned to synchronize flame assaults with supporting fire. Tanks were kept in reserve until fortifications were identified, then brought forward in short, devastating surges. Coordination was paramount. Flame operators needed cover from machine guns and mortars, while infantry needed clear signals to advance after each burst. On the Japanese side, leadership was equally determined. Reports from surviving officers at Saipan and Okinawa reveal a grim acceptance. Flame was the one weapon they could not counter. Underground positions were strengthened, with deeper tunnels and stone reinforcements, but even then, the flame's oxygen-depleting effect suffocated defenders long before heat reached them. Japanese commanders responded with desperate innovation: suicide attacks against flame tanks, snipers trained to spot fuel lines, and underground galleries designed to vent heat. Yet none of it stopped the inevitable. Once the fuel reached inside, every plan collapsed. The moral cost did not go unnoticed. War correspondents wrote in careful tones, avoiding sensational language. Reports mentioned heat weapons or liquid fire, rather than describing their true effects. Soldiers rarely spoke about what they saw afterward. Commanders, too, carried the weight, balancing the need to win against the horror of the means required. But necessity had already chosen its path. In the labyrinth of Pacific jungles and volcanic ridges, there were no alternatives. Fire was the only tool that reached every corner, every hidden room of resistance. By 1945, the combination of technology and leadership had created a new kind of warfare, one where engineers shaped victory as much as generals. And it was in this crucible of invention and endurance that the most defining battles of the Pacific were fought, the moments when jungles became oceans of flame and strategy became survival. March 1945, the island of Iwo Jima, 8 square miles of black volcanic ash, pitted with caves and tunnels that ran deep beneath Mount Suribachi. American Marines had been fighting for weeks, clawing forward yard by yard through a terrain that seemed alive with hidden fire. Every rock concealed a gun. Every hill was a fortress. By the time the 5th Marine Division prepared for its next push toward the northern ridges, the air was thick with sulfur smoke and the smell of burned fuel. Naval gunfire had turned the landscape into a wasteland, yet the Japanese defense held firm. Their commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had built an underground city, nearly 11 miles of tunnels connecting more than 1,500 bunkers, artillery rooms, and living quarters. It was an engineer's nightmare. Explosives failed to collapse the tunnels. Artillery shells sank harmlessly into soft ash. The only way forward was through the entrances, one by one. That morning, the assault began. Ahead of the infantry rolled a line of Sherman tanks modified with flamethrowers, the POWs H-1 Zippo tanks. Behind them, squads of engineers carried portable flamethrowers, crouched low, their tanks gleaming with condensation. Each team moved with riflemen covering from behind, all eyes fixed on the dark mouths of caves that dotted the ridge like open wounds. A single signal flare went up. Red. The tanks advanced. The first burst of flame erupted from the lead Sherman's nozzle with a sound like a cannon blast, followed by a steady, low roar. A river of napalm surged into the nearest cave opening, rolling along the ground before surging upward in a fountain of fire. The explosion of heat could be felt hundreds of feet away. Inside, the temperature spiked instantly. Ammunition cooked off. The cave's oxygen vanished in seconds. Survivors stumbled out, uniforms burning, some collapsing before they reached the open air. Within moments, the position that had resisted for days was silent. Across the line, the pattern repeated. Marines marked each cleared position with colored smoke to avoid re-engagement. Engineers advanced, checking for secondary tunnels. Some found only charred helmets and melted weapons, the traces of what had once been entire platoons. The battle unfolded with an industrial rhythm. Flame, advance, smoke, silence, then another burst, another hill, another pocket erased. The sound of it was unearthly, a low mechanical breathing punctuated by short, violent bursts. Reporters who witnessed the scene described the sight as the mountain itself on fire. Night offered no reprieve. In the darkness, the flames drew long orange lines across the horizon, painting the ridge in motion like a living organism of fire. Japanese soldiers who survived initial attacks tried to adapt. Some dug secondary exits hoping to escape the heat. Others waited until the tanks withdrew, then counterattacked in suicidal rushes, clutching satchel charges or grenades. But against fire, courage was no armor. Most never reached their targets. In one engagement near Hill 362A, Marine flamethrower operators advanced alongside riflemen from the 26th Regiment. They were met with bursts of machine gun fire from interlocked cave systems. For every cave cleared, another opened from behind. The Marines adapted, using flame tanks to saturate one entrance while infantry sealed another with demolitions. When the fuel ran out, engineers refilled under cover of night, refueling with hoses connected to tankers positioned hundreds of yards yards behind the lines. The heat was relentless. Ash turned to glass beneath the tank's treads. The air shimmered, heavy with vaporized fuel. By the end of that day, over 200 caves had been destroyed. Marines advancing behind the tanks encountered almost no resistance. The ground was black, steaming, and lifeless. The cost was still high. Snipers targeted the flame operators. A single well-aimed round into a tank's hose or fuel reservoir could ignite it instantly. One Sherman took a hit near its nozzle assembly. The flame tank exploded in a column of fire visible from the beaches. Inside, the crew had no chance. Their deaths were as violent as those they fought to destroy. Still, the assault pressed on. Fire had become both weapon and shield, clearing the unseen and protecting those who followed. Each burned bunker, each sealed cave, brought the Americans closer to breaking the island's final line of resistance. By nightfall, the ridge was theirs. The Japanese defense, once an intricate network of tunnels and chambers, was collapsing into silence. The last defenders retreated deeper into the volcanic rock, seeking air and time that no longer existed. For the men on the surface, victory had no sound, only the slow hiss of cooling metal and the faint crackle of a jungle turned to ash. But beneath that silence, deep underground, hundreds still lived, waiting, trapped in darkness that would soon ignite again. By the second week of March 1945, the battle for Iwo Jima had turned from assault to extermination. The island's ridges, once alive with rifle fire and shouts, had fallen eerily quiet. The Marines knew what that silence meant. The enemy was not gone, only deeper. Every ravine, crater, and crevice concealed the entrance to another tunnel. Japanese soldiers, sealed off from supplies and sunlight, clung to life underground. Their commander, General Kuribayashi, refused to surrender. His last transmissions to Tokyo spoke of honor, not hope. The enemy advances, but we fight still. Above them, the Americans adapted their methods again. Engineers with flamethrowers and demolition packs descended into the labyrinth of trenches and shell holes. They worked methodically, cave by cave, sealing openings, igniting chambers, and marking cleared zones with white tape. The terrain resembled a lunar landscape: black ash, twisted metal, and the skeletons of palm trees jutting from the earth. Flame tanks formed a ring around Mount Suribachi's base. Each advance began with bursts of napalm directed into suspected openings, followed by demolitions and smoke grenades. The flames rolled through tunnels like liquid wind, devouring oxygen and leaving only scorched silence behind. The Marines moved cautiously, listening for the faint hiss that marked a hidden vent, a sign that life still hid beneath their boots. Inside those tunnels, Japanese soldiers endured a hell without end. Fuel vapors seeped through cracks. Heat built until walls glowed. Those who survived the first blasts tried to fight back, coughing, eyes watering, firing blindly through smoke-filled passages. Many suffocated before ever seeing their enemy. Others, realizing escape was impossible, pulled grenades to their chests, choosing instant death over slow fire. The American commanders had no illusions about what was happening. They had seen what flame could do and what it could spare them. Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, described the battle in his diary. "There is no other way. We burn them out or we lose the hill." Each cave cleared meant fewer ambushes, fewer snipers, and fewer sudden deaths for the infantry above ground. But it also meant erasing hundreds of men in seconds. Men who, by their own code, would never surrender. It was efficiency measured in fire. On March 11th, a coordinated assault targeted the last major tunnel complex north of the airfield. The 4th Marine Division used 6 flame tanks in rotation, each releasing controlled bursts of napalm down vent shafts located by engineers. The fuel burned for minutes at a time, consuming every trace of oxygen. When the last tank withdrew, the tunnels collapsed inward from the heat. The ground itself seemed to sigh, a slow, hollow rumble as air escaped through fissures in the rock. When scouts entered hours later, the chambers were silent. Burned weapons lay fused into the walls. The dead were unrecognizable, reduced to outlines against scorched stone. Few reports recorded the scene in detail. The official summary used only one sentence: resistance neutralized. Across the island, the same grim process unfolded. At one cave, Marines discovered an entire platoon of Japanese soldiers who had died standing, rifles in hand, as if guarding a position that no longer existed. At another, they found melted swords and a Japanese flag half turned to ash. By mid-March, organized resistance on Iwo Jima ceased to exist. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 300 were taken alive. Most had died in the tunnels, many by their own hand. For the Americans, the price had been staggering: nearly 7,000 dead and over 19,000 wounded. Yet for the first time in the Pacific, an island fortress that Japan had vowed to hold to the death was completely under U.S. control. The airfields carved into its volcanic soil would soon launch the bombers that reached Japan's heartland. The fire that had devoured the Iwo Mountain now fueled the next phase of war. And in that victory lay a dark realization: this new method of warfare, the merging of technology, chemistry, and human will, had changed the very nature of combat. The jungle, the cave, the fortress, none could hide from it. But the war was not over. On Okinawa, just weeks later, the cycle would begin again. The hills there were greener, the air thicker, followed by silence. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the rain-soaked cliffs of Okinawa, the lesson was the same. The flame did not stop until there was nothing left to burn. And when the smoke finally cleared, the world would have to confront confront what it had created, a weapon that turned not only the battlefield but also human conscience into something scorched and irreparable. But the war was not over. On Okinawa, just weeks later, the cycle would begin again. The hills there were greener, the air thicker, and the villages still full of civilians. Yet the same pattern would unfold, fire descending upon the earth, followed by silence. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the rain-soaked cliffs of Okinawa, the lesson was the same. The flame did not stop until there was nothing left to burn, and when the smoke finally cleared, the world would have to confront what it had created, a weapon that turned not only the battlefield, but also human conscience into something scorched and irreparable. When the smoke cleared from Iwo Jima and the ash settled on the cratered slopes, the U.S. military did more than occupy ground. It learned. The flamethrower, once a specialized tool, had proven its tactical worth in ways that reshaped assault doctrine across the Pacific. First, the weapon altered assault sequencing. Pre-invasion plans now routinely embedded flame elements at the point of the spear. Naval and aerial bombardment softened outer defenses. Then flame tanks and infantry-mounted flamethrowers methodically took the gaps that bombardment could not reach. Assault plans added explicit phases for flame suppression, demolition charges, and engineers to follow in close order. Where previously infantry might clear a pillbox with grenades and bayonets, commanders now ordered combined arms bursts, tank flame, smoke to obscure movement, then demolition to seal the cavity. Second, the logistics of fire demanded organization. Napalm and thickened fuels were not incidental supplies. They required dedicated shipping, storage, and handling procedures. Supply chains extended from refineries to forward tank farms and into field tankers that refueled flame tanks under blackout conditions. Maintenance crews learned to service valves, hoses, and ignition systems in the field. Ordnance sections stocked specialized spare parts. The Chemical Warfare Service, long a peripheral branch, became central to planning and supply for many Pacific operations. Third, battlefield engineering changed. Engineers who once focused on bridging and demolition became experts in ventilation, sealing, and tunnel denial. Sappers developed standard operating procedures for isolating cave networks, mapping airflows, identifying secondary exits, and placing charges to collapse passages after flame ingress. Reconnaissance priorities shifted to include tunnel mouth reconnaissance and geological surveys to predict internal tunnel behavior under heat. Fourth, combined arms coordination deepened. Flame tanks required protective screens from anti-tank weapons and infantry to clear close-range threats. Artillery missions were retasked to suppress potential counters, while flamethrowers performed the close work. Radio discipline and prearranged signals took on new importance. A mistimed barrage could send flame back toward friendly trenches or strand a refueling crew in the open. Fifth, the tactic reduced but did not eliminate American casualties. Flame assaults shortened siege times and reduced protracted close-quarters fighting, which often saved lives that would have been lost in repeated manual clearing. However, the weapon also concentrated risk in new ways. Fuel convoys became targets, flame operators were high-value targets, and the catastrophic loss of a flame tank could produce horrific casualties among crews. Commanders weighed these trade-offs in every operation, calculating that burning out a bunker could protect a company of infantry from attrition. Finally, the tactical success carried strategic ripple effects. The demonstrated effectiveness of flame attacks accelerated the prioritization of specialized armor in assault fleets. CB and Army workshops standardized flame tank conversions, and post-battle reports recommended keeping rotational flame assets in any operation likely to encounter deep fortifications. The scale of destruction also influenced amphibious doctrine. Planners accepted that some objectives would be won at the cost of transformed landscapes rather than negotiated prize towns. By mid-1945, when American planners looked toward the Japanese home islands, the lessons were clear. Fortified cave networks, urban strongpoints, and civilian-dense towns would present the same challenges encountered across the Pacific. For many planners, that reality fed into a grim calculus about the expected cost of invasion and lent urgency to seeking alternatives. Still, doctrine and logistics aside, the most immediate consequences were measured in burned-out tunnels, refitted tanks, and maps filled with newly marked hazards. The weapon had solved a tactical puzzle, how to reach the hidden defender, but it had also created new operational demands that lingered long after the last flames cooled. This technical and organizational aftermath fed directly into a deeper reckoning. The human and moral costs of using fire as an instrument of war the battlefield may have quieted, but the silence carried a weight that would linger for generations. For those who fought with flamethrowers and those who faced them, the war had crossed an invisible threshold. Fire, once an accident of battle, had become a deliberate instrument. Reports from Iwo Jima and Okinawa tell of Marines who refused to watch their own work. Operators often turned their heads aside as they triggered the weapon, unable to look at what followed. A flamethrower's range was short, 30 to 40 yards, and its victims were close enough to see and to hear. The weapon's effect was instantaneous, but its memory was not. Many veterans described recurring nightmares of tunnels glowing like furnaces and voices echoing inside. The moral debate began even before the war ended. Some correspondents described the use of fire as a necessary cruelty, arguing that it saved American lives by eliminating ambushes and reducing prolonged siege fighting. Others questioned the ethics of a weapon that left no room for surrender. There was no white flag visible through a wall of flame. Japanese survivors spoke rarely, but when they did, their words revealed another layer of horror. Many had been ordered never to surrender. For them, the flame was not just a weapon, but an ending forced upon them. Some officers wrote final notes in diaries, preserved by chance in sealed caves. "We are burned alive in honor." Historians would later interpret those writings as reflections of the Bushido Code distorted by desperation, yet they also showed the psychological effect of encountering a weapon that erased the possibility of fighting back. The U.S. military studied these reactions carefully. Analysts within the Army's Psychological Warfare Division noted that flame weapons produced an outsized shock effect. Defenders often abandoned positions at the mere sound of an igniter. In later conflicts, this observation would shape not only tactics, but deterrence theory itself. Strategically, the lessons extended far beyond the islands. The destruction of fortified positions through intense, localized fire informed Cold War military engineering. Bunkers designed with flame-resistant materials, ventilation systems adapted to prevent fuel vapor infiltration, and countermeasures against incendiary weapons. Fire had become both a weapon and a design principle, yet the human cost was impossible to engineer away. After the war, returning flamethrower operators faced their own silence. Many found that their actions, though sanctioned by necessity, remained unspeakable in peace. The Army discontinued man-portable flamethrowers by the early 1950s, replacing them with mechanized systems and eventually phasing out the concept altogether by the Vietnam era. The reasoning was partly technical. Modern explosives had grown more efficient, but also moral. The image of soldiers carrying tanks of burning fuel on their backs had become too haunting, too tied to an era of total war. Japan, too, bore the psychological scars. The survivors of island garrisons that had endured flamethrower attacks returned home to a nation that had been burned on an even greater scale by incendiary bombing. Entire cities, Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, would experience on a massive scale what soldiers had felt in the caves: the roar, the suffocation, and the instant erasure. Fire had moved from the battlefield to the home front, and the line between combatant and civilian had blurred forever. In the post-war tribunals, flame weapons were not classified as illegal. They were judged within the accepted laws of war. Yet even among those who studied them, there was an unspoken unease. The flame was too absolute, too final to be fully reconciled with human restraint. Strategists later summarized the lesson in practical terms. Fire was effective but uncontrollable. Once unleashed, it spared nothing. Soldier or structure, defender or soil. That realization became one of the quiet foundations for the next era of warfare. The superpowers of the Cold War would pursue weapons of precision, not proximity, arms designed to kill at a distance, to sanitize destruction through range and technology. Yet behind every button and missile silo lay the memory of the men who had once carried fire on their backs, watching it consume the world in front of them. The jungle and tunnels of the Pacific were gone, reclaimed by rain and vines. But beneath their surface, fragments of charred steel and glass still told the story of a war where the earth itself burned, and soldiers learned that victory, when bought with fire, always left a shadow behind. When historians speak of the Pacific War, they often measure it in miles gained, ships sunk, or battles won. But beneath those figures lies a more fragile ledger, one written in fire. The flamethrower was born of desperation, refined by necessity, and buried by conscience. It turned jungles into deserts, caves into graves, and soldiers into witnesses of their own power. It did what artillery could not. It forced the unseen enemy into light, and in doing so, it forced mankind to look at itself. To the Americans who carried it, the weapon was both salvation and burden. It saved their comrades, opened paths through death, and silenced ambushes that might have killed hundreds more. Yet long after the war, many still spoke of the sound, the roar that drowned out everything human in battle. For the Japanese soldiers who faced it, the flamethrower represented the full weight of industrial warfare, a force that no courage could withstand. It reduced fortitude to fuel, and in that annihilation lay a truth that neither side could escape. Technology had outpaced the limits of honor. When the war ended, nations sought distance from that truth. The weapon was dismantled, its tanks melted down, and its manuals sealed in archives. But the lesson endured, that in total war, even victory can scorch the soul of those who win it. Today, the remnants of those battles rest quietly beneath tropical soil. Nature has reclaimed the ground. Trees rise where fire once ruled. Yet beneath the roots lie the ashes of an era when humanity learned how swiftly invention can become devastation. The flamethrower no longer appears on the battlefield, but its echo remains, a warning carried through every new weapon forged since. For in the end, the story of fire in war is not only about destruction, it is about what is left behind when the flames go out, and whether, in the darkness that follows, humanity still remembers what it set ablaze.